So, Pokémon Colosseum. This game has always sat in kind of a funny place in the Pokémon franchise. You have the mainline games, the turn-based RPGs where you go around exploring places, catching Pokémon, and leveling them up. You have the spin-off games, which feature Pokémon characters and iconography, but in a completely different genre of gameplay. Things like the Mystery Dungeon series, the Ranger series, or Pokopia. Then, somewhere in between the mainline games and the spin-off games, you have the side series, a fan term for a certain group of spin-off games that were directly compatible with the mainline games. You could transfer in Pokemon and have them battle against CPU opponents or other players with the traditional turn-based mechanics, and sometimes for completing certain challenges, the player would receive rewards that could subsequently be transferred back into the mainline games, but these were seemingly intended to be add-ons rather than standalone experiences. Something extra you could do with your Pokemon from the handheld games once you'd completed the main story. When the handheld technology got good enough that all of these extra challenges could simply be included within the mainline games, the existence of these battle simulators probably became a little redundant, so they started to get phased out, with the last one coming out early in Generation 4. Finally, somewhere in between the mainline games and the side series games, you have Pokémon Colosseum. Officially, Colosseum is considered a spin-off, but unlike the other side series spin-offs like Stadium or Battle Revolution, Colosseum comes with a story mode, which, at least in terms of gameplay mechanics, is very akin to a mainline game. It has a pretty different tone and setting, but it has an actual plot, and you explore an overworld where you catch Pokemon and level them up. Despite their official designation, it's long been a topic of discussion among fans whether Colosseum, and its sequel, which I'll hopefully get to in a future video, should be included in the conversation when talking about the main series. As you can probably tell by now, I have decided to include them, largely because, why not? Again, in terms of gameplay mechanics, they're Pokemon games through and through. It would arguably be more arbitrary to exclude them than it is to include them. Compared to the main series, you don't see that much discussion about Colosseum, probably because not nearly as many people have played Colosseum. I mean, Crystal was the single worst selling mainline game, and Colosseum barely sold a third as many units. But whenever it is brought up, it's almost exclusively in a positive context. People praise it for its darker tone and setting, its expressive battle animations, and the fact that it provides something a bit different while retaining the familiar core gameplay mechanics. All appraisals I do agree with, to an extent. But is it really the underrated gem its fanbase says it is? After playing it, I'm not so certain. It definitely has its moments, but overall, I get the sense that people like the idea of this game on paper a lot more than it is actually fun to play through. Colosseum starts the player off in a very different position compared to the main series. Normally, we play as a young child who only just became a trainer. Our first impression of the protagonist is usually them being told off by an adult not to go off on their own without any Pokemon. In Colosseum, we play as an older teenager, who in the opening cutscene steals some high-tech looking device from out of a building and blows the whole thing up behind him as he runs away. We find out soon afterwards that this building was the base of a villainous group known for stealing Pokemon from trainers, and that our protagonist was a former member who turned traitor. He's also shown to have a history as a trainer. This is the first game in the series where we already have Pokemon in our party right from the moment we gain control of our character. A level 25 Espeon, and a level 26 Umbreon. So, these are our starters, effectively. It might sound a bit mean, especially since the Met location describes him as our old friend, but it's probably best to just box Umbreon. I kept him on the team in a previous playthrough, and for reasons I'll get into shortly, Pokemon that are pure walls simply aren't very helpful or fun to use in this game. Normally, when I play through a Pokemon game, I have a few self-imposed rules, but to be frank, most of my usual rules aren't necessary in this game, as will become clear throughout the video. Aside from not using any Pokemon I've already had on my team in previous games, all, like, 5 that are even in Colosseum, The only one I still implemented was my rule not to use healing items from the bag during battle, but even this I was a bit looser with than I normally am. A lot of Pokémon Colosseum is based around catching Pokémon, and when a Pokémon I was trying to catch was being particularly stubborn, I saw no issue with using potions in those instances. Especially since, in Pokémon Colosseum, if you miss an opportunity to catch something, it can often be quite a lengthy process to get another shot. Anyway, since we start out immediately with Pokémon already in our party, out of all the Pokémon RPGs, this is probably the shortest amount of time it takes to get to the first battle of the game. The battles are where the biggest gameplay difference between Colosseum and the main series becomes apparent. Every battle in this game is a double battle. This is why it's probably best not to keep Umbreon on the team. In double battles, you generally want both of your Pokémon to actually be able to deal damage to the opponents themselves, or at least assist their ally in doing damage. When a Pokémon's main role is to just sit there and absorb hits, they're essentially just turning the battle into a 2v1 for the opponent. This is also why it wasn't necessary to implement my usual rule about turning on set mode. Switch mode doesn't exist for double battles, they're all locked into set mode by default. At least on paper, I think this is a huge plus for this game. I've said before that I love double battles, and one of my criticisms with Ruby and Sapphire, the game where they were introduced, was that they were massively underutilized. A lot of trainers throughout the game will also actually employ strategies that take advantage of the double battle format. They'll use moves that activate their allies' abilities. One boss has a team of Pokémon that will each alternate between using Earthquake and Protect. Another boss will use Pokémon with Lightning Rod to protect his water flying types from electric type moves, and in these tougher battles, the player is strongly encouraged to do the same. If you want to use Earthquake, for example, a move that in single battles, especially in the older games, is often just an automatic win button, you have to think about which Pokémon is in your other slot because the move is going to target them as well. This is exactly why I tend to really like double battles. Sweeping an entire team by spamming one move with one Pokémon basically isn't possible like it is in single battles. You generally have to put a bit more thought into what you're doing. I do have one issue with double battles, specifically in this generation, though. It is pretty annoying that whenever one of your Pokémon faints, the game forces you to send in the next one in the middle of a turn that's already underway. For example, I might have my Quagsire and Misdreavus out, and decide to use Earthquake with my Quagsire since Misdreavus has Levitate and will therefore avoid the move. However, after the turn starts, Misdreavus unexpectedly goes down to a hit from a speedy opponent. And now I immediately have to send in either my Magcargo or my Plusle, even though I know they're just going to be taken down themselves by the incoming Earthquake from my Quagsire, before they even have a chance to select a move. Yeah, sometimes it was fun to plan strategies where I would try and preemptively target an opposing Pokémon as it was sent in mid-turn, but overall, I think it was a pretty good decision to change this in the next generation, so that you don't have to send in another Pokémon until the next turn. Another thing the battle system in this game often receives praise for is the animations. They're often compared favorably to the much more basic animations in the recent 3D games, and in a vacuum, I do agree that the ones in Colosseum are much better. When you're partaking in a tough, important feeling battle, like this game's equivalent of the Champion or the last few rounds of Mount Battle, these animations do really enhance the experience. They make it all feel a lot more epic. However, when praising the important boss fights for their difficulty and well thought out design, and how much they're enhanced by these fancy animations, it's important to remember that the vast majority of fights in this game are not important boss fights. When you're doing more menial tasks like grinding levels, or trying to catch something, or battling Evil Teen Grunt number 346 with her team of Spinarak's and Ledybez, all you really notice after a while is how much longer these elaborate, fancy animations take compared to their simpler counterparts. As a point of comparison, let's see how long it takes to get from the moment the battle music starts to the end of the first turn in a typical early game double battle in Pokémon Colosseum versus Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire. Every battle in Colosseum is a double battle. So you always have to have at least 2 Pokemon on your team. I don't really know what the in-universe explanation is for why the people of the Ore region just want, like, only, like, double battles. They never do single battles. But that's how it is. It's the first time in the whole game we've taken damage. Turns go on for such a long time in Colosseum. I've taken issue with this in some of the older mainline games as well, however, those games offered a built-in solution. Whenever I got to a really long gauntlet of unimportant trainers, I could simply turn off battle animations. This would make these sections go so much faster. No such option exists in Colosseum. This is the first game in the series where I found myself actively avoiding optional trainers unless I was intentionally grinding levels. Normally, when I'm playing a Pokemon game, I like to fight as many trainers as I can in order to keep up with the game's level curve and minimize the possibility of having to grind later, but in this game, every random battle just felt like way too much of a tangent. When I'm fighting one of the leaders of Cypher and his team of monsters, I'm fully on board with all 4 Pokemon getting their own designated dramatic entrance to the battlefield, and all 4 Pokemon striking a cool pose as they use a move, and all 4 Pokemon bracing themselves, getting knocked down and recovering as they're hit by a move, and all affected Pokemon being pelted by whatever weather conditions may be active, and any Pokemon that fainted that turn taking a theatrical fall before being recalled. But when I'm battling Ryder Willy with his team of Zigzagoons, I'm usually thinking, can we maybe speed this up a bit? Team building works very differently in Pokémon Colosseum compared to the main series. There are no wild Pokémon at all. Aside from the Espeon and Umbreon you start out with, the only gift Pokémon in the entire game is a Plusle, one that's annoyingly underleveled if you want to add them to your team. Primarily, the player catches Pokemon for their team by stealing them from other trainers. Normally, your Pokeballs are prevented from working when you try to use them on a Pokemon that already has a trainer. The device the protagonist stole at the beginning of the game is a snag machine, which overrides this. It's kind of interesting that the main character's status as more of an anti-hero isn't just window dressing, and is actually incorporated into the gameplay a bit. The in-universe justification is that you're only catching shadow Pokemon. Basically, Pokemon that were experimented on by evil scientists to the point where they're a legitimate danger to themselves and others, so they need to be identified and taken to be purified. But it's not like we give them back to their trainers afterwards. Yeah, most trainers with shadow Pokemon are explicitly working with the game's villains, but a couple of them are just random people the shadow Pokemon happen to fall into the hands of. It is kind of strange that after obtaining a Pokemon this way, we're considered the original trainer. It does somewhat take away from the lore argument that Pokemon are creatures with agency who choose to follow trainers, when forcefully taking them instead of trading is enough to make the Pokemon go, actually, you're my original trainer now. It's also kind of strange that most of these trainers don't really seem to care that much that we stole one of their Pokemon. A lot of them don't even seem to notice. Whatever, I don't think they thought that deeply about it when programming this mechanic. It's an interesting idea on paper, but in practice, I did find catching Pokemon during double battles against entire teams to be kind of annoying. I already think catching is recurringly my least favorite core mechanic in the Pokemon series. Shockingly, making it so you have to get through an entire team before you even get a shot at catching them, and making it significantly more likely to accidentally KO the Pokemon you're trying to catch when you weren't even intending to attack it at all, did not make it more enjoyable for me. Oh, good thing I used a not very effective move with Sunma. Can it just not hit Pokemon that are higher leveled or something? It's missed twice in a row. Apparently even that was enough. Alright. So that's the first shadow Pokemon I've missed then. If you haven't noticed that graphic in the top right, there are 48 shadow Pokemon in the game. 4 are only available in the post-game, and another 6 can only be caught in the Final Gauntlet of the main adventure, so can only be added to your team before the credits if you intentionally lose said gauntlet. Add in the 3 gift Pokemon you're given, and you're left with 41, making Colosseum have by far the smallest roster of Pokemon available to the player out of any Pokemon RPG. Also, while this game technically doesn't have a Pokédex, if we count the snag list as an equivalent, then it is also one of only 2 times a regional Pokédex has contained no Pokemon from Gen 1. There are a couple of exceptions, but by and large, the theme of the Pokemon available to the player in this game is Gen 2 Pokemon that weren't in the Hoenn Pokédex and don't evolve from Gen 1 Pokemon. Not every Pokemon in this game matches that description, but pretty near 100% of the Pokemon that match that description are in this game. The only exceptions are Lugia, Celebi, and Unknown, of all things. On one hand, sometimes I like it when the game limits the player's options. It can force them to engage with Pokemon that they wouldn't normally consider. But on the other hand, I think the options in Colosseum might be a bit too limited. You're really only given access to 1 or 2 Pokemon of every type, and bluntly, a lot of them simply are not viable options even in a game with this few of them. So if you want your team to have any amount of cohesion, the amount of possible combinations you can wind up with is very small compared to the other games. I'll take a gander and say that in about 90% of playthroughs the team was probably Espeon, Umbreon, Johto Starter, Ampharos, one of the legendary beasts, and maybe one miscellaneous, likely Quagsire, Mischievous, Flygon, or Heracross. Not only that, they all become available in a fixed order as well. You always start with the same Espeon and Umbreon, you always catch a Makuhita first at the same level, etc. If they were going to have this ultra small roster of Pokemon available, it might have been kinda nice if their locations were at least semi-randomized, for a bit of variety between playthroughs. So, there are some things I like about the adventure of Pokémon Colosseum. As I've said, I like the grungier setting and somewhat darker tone, and I do think the main character is a simple but pretty cool protagonist. Plus, it's a small thing, but I do like that in this game the protagonist's reputation actually precedes him sometimes. In the mainline games, if this even happens at all, it's usually relegated to the villainous team themselves. Like, you'd think a team being led by a child prodigy taking down an infamous criminal syndicate would be bigger news than it is. But in Colosseum, a number of other characters will recognize and greet you as the guy who's been standing up to Cypher. That being said, I do think the cool protagonist is somewhat counterbalanced by a not-so-great deuteragonist. I do not like Rui very much. Her character is pretty whatever. It's one of those instances where why are we even playing as a silent protagonist when we have a second character following us around, saying pretty much everything we would be saying anyway. She's mostly just a plot device. For unexplained reasons, she can see auras and therefore can tell when a Pokemon has been turned into a shadow Pokemon. I don't know why they couldn't have just given the main character this ability, but whatever. My annoyance with her is actually mainly from a gameplay perspective. For some reason, they gave her collision data in the overworld, meaning every time you try to change direction, she gets in your way, and it's actually possible for her to trap you. I found this room in Team Snag'em's hideout where if she and this NPC both stand in a specific spot, they can actually both get stuck and form a wall, blocking the player in. I wish I had the footage of this happening to me organically, but unfortunately, about an hour of my gameplay is missing. Because, for the first time in this series, I committed the blunder of forgetting to hit record. Forgot to start fucking recording. I think that's the first time in this whole series I've done that, actually. The only fun I was able to have with her was getting her stuck somewhere, and then activating dialogue she was obviously supposed to be present for. Also this. Oh, it's like a conga line.
Keep it going, keep it going, keep it going. Get back in line, Rui.
Some of the minor characters are pretty fun. Mirror B is just such a silly concept for an evil team admin and has such a goofy design and way of talking that it's basically impossible to forget him. Silva is kind of endearing, how he keeps trying to help, but he keeps failing and getting caught, but he keeps trying anyway. Some of the random grunts, or peons as they're called in this game, have pretty funny dialogue. I especially like these two guards who impulsively blow up an entire room to prevent you from accessing their base, and then one of them says, "Geez, was that not a bit excessive?" To which the other responds, "Well, it's too late now," and they both just run off. Good stuff. Alright, that's about where my positives for the main adventure of Pokémon Colosseum end. The pacing in this game is utterly bizarre. Somehow it feels breakneck fast, but excruciatingly slow at the same time. I think it's because there are only around 5 or 6 locations in the entire game, but we spend such a long time in each one, and barely any of that time is spent doing anything even remotely interesting. A pretty significant portion of it will just be backtracking. The dungeons in this game have a lot of mandatory trainers. I said earlier that in boss fights, I liked how you generally weren't able to sweep through teams in the same way you can in single battles, but against these random trainers, it usually just adds to the game's tedium. They're never going to win, but they're virtually always going to sneak in a bit of damage, or even worse, a status condition. And eventually, you're going to want to heal. Even ignoring that shopping in this game is an entire excursion in and of itself, considering basically every type of item is only sold in one particular store in one particular town, money can be pretty tight in Colosseum. If you're going for game completionism, you always have to be heavily stocked with Pokeballs in case you run into a Shadow Pokemon, many of whom have pretty damn low catch rates. And that means you're not going to have much money left over for potions and other healing items. And I don't even think I was overspending on these Pokeballs throughout the game. I ran out a few times. So most of the time, if you want to heal off the damage you took, you have to backtrack to the nearest healing machine. And outside of towns, these can be pretty scarce. As a matter of fact, some of these lengthy dungeons, most notably the Shadow Pokemon Lab, don't have a healing machine at all, so in order to heal, you either had to deposit all your Pokemon in the PC and take them all back out again, or you had to exit the area altogether and go use a healing machine in a different area. As always when I'm describing something like this, doing it once may not sound that annoying, but when you have to do it regularly throughout the entire game, it really stacks up. And these dungeons can feel like they go on forever. I swear the first one, Pyrite Building, which extends directly into Pyrite Cave, alone almost makes up the first quarter of the game. I gave it the benefit of the doubt at first. Maybe this was just an unfortunate early section and it would get better later, but it quickly became clear this experience was just what the game was. There was a very brief interlude in Auget Village before the next almost quarter of the adventure was spent at Mount Battle doing the exact same thing. Fighting trainers who were far too weak to stand any real chance of winning, but just strong enough to make it so you have to go all the way back to heal the Pokemon you're trying to train every battle or two. And then there was another brief interlude in the Under before the next almost quarter of the game was spent in the Shadow Pokemon Lab. And then there was basically no interlude at all, and the next almost quarter of the game was spent in Realgam Tower, the final area. At least this last one is a bit more of a boss rush than a traditional dungeon, so most of the fights feel a bit more like actual challenges than pure filler. Any time in story mode that isn't spent in this riveting gameplay loop, walking in and out of the same dungeon over and over, is instead spent grinding levels. Colosseum has a very unforgiving level curve, and compared to the other games I've covered so far in this series, it's far more important that the player keeps up with it. Since unlike those, Colosseum does not give a boost to the player Pokemon stats based on what gym badges they have, because there are no gym badges in Colosseum. Thing is, Colosseum has the exact same problem as the Johto games, where even though there are a lot of random trainers, their weak, often unevolved Pokemon don't give much experience, so even if the player fights every single one, they're still eventually going to get left behind by the bosses, level-wise. Plus, some of the level jumps in this game are just absurd no matter how you slice it. Venus has an almost 10 level jump from Dakeem, the previous boss, despite there being no required story battles in between them. The only way you're going to catch up is by fighting the optional trainers at Mount Battle, who don't give any money, by the way, so you can't grind that this way, and it takes a while before they start to give any substantial experience as well. So basically, imagine if Mount Moon, Rock Tunnel, Silphco, and Victory Road together took up about 90% of the game, and every time you wanted to heal or save, you had to manually walk all the way back out, possibly travel to a different town altogether, and then manually walk all the way back in order to resume your progress. Then imagine if each of them had about 2 or 3 times as many trainers as they do, you had to battle every single one of them, and they all just had a full team of Magikarps, holding Focus Sashes and using Endeavor. Or Thunderwave. Finally, at the end of each dungeon, there's a boss with a full team of Mewtwo's that are all 15 levels higher than what your team would realistically be at that point, so you're forced to grind everything to a screeching halt and fight 100 extra Magikarp trainers to get your team to catch up. That's basically what the main adventure of Pokémon Colosseum is like. Despite technically not having a Pokémon League, the final area of Colosseum concludes with a gauntlet that effectively serves as the game's equivalent of the Elite Four and Champion. Most of the trainers aren't nearly as strong as an Elite Four would normally be, but it's actually more of a gauntlet than the Pokémon League normally is, because the player isn't given an opportunity to change the Pokémon they have in the lead or even heal with items in between each battle. Still, at least with the first 4 trainers, most of the difficulty comes when trying to catch each of their Shadow Pokémon, assuming you're bothering with that. I failed my first attempt at the gauntlet, though thankfully I caught every Shadow Pokémon along the way, including the last guy's Metagross in a total Hail Mary at full health.
And it doesn't even KO, alright. Once again, might as well just Hail Mary a Pokeball when he switches in the fucking Metagross here. Are you fucking kidding me? I'm gonna lose still. But you do get to keep it. I fucking just threw an Ultra Ball at full health Metagross, which is one of the hardest Pokemon in the whole game to catch.
So I didn't have to worry about that at all on my second attempt. When the 5th guy is defeated, it's revealed that he actually wasn't the boss of the villainous team. This guy, who the player met towards the start of the game, is revealed to have been the true leader all along. And out of nowhere, he might just be the best final boss in the series so far. Okay, the character of the main villain sucks. Oh, you thought it was this block of wood who already had barely any screen time? It was actually this other random guy who was in one scene earlier. It's literally the Johnson Smith Pro ZD sketch. But his battle is amazing. It has one of the best battle themes in the whole series, no exaggeration, and his team is so well-rounded. If I had any criticisms with this fight from a gameplay perspective, it is another kind of absurd level jump, though that's nothing new for this game. And I would say maybe it's a little cheap that he has a Salamence on his team, when there are basically no decent Ice-type moves available to the player without spending ages grinding for the prohibitively expensive Ice Beam TM at Mount Battle. But even then, trying to plan a line around this kinda just added to the fun for me. I lost my first attempt against him without getting too far, but thankfully, for this specific battle, the game doesn't make you repeat the entire gauntlet. You can just rematch him immediately. On my second attempt, he leads with Scizor and Slacking, while I lead with Plusle and Heracross. I decide to make it a priority to take out his Slacking, because he has another Pokemon that you really don't want out at the same time as his Slacking. So Heracross uses a Helping Hand boosted Brick Break to deal as much damage as possible immediately. Meanwhile, Slacking takes out Plusle with Earthquake, though does decent damage to Scizor as well. I replace Plusle with Magcargo, and while Slacking is loafing, Heracross finishes him off with another Brick Break, while Magcargo takes down Scizor with Flamethrower. He then sends in Salamence and Machamp, and at this point I'm still wondering what I can even do about Salamence with my team, but then I have an idea. With Magcargo, I just attack randomly, fully expecting them to go down this turn, while with Heracross, I use Endure, a move I don't think I've ever even thought to use in single player before. Salamence goes for the KO on Heracross, as I expected, and Heracross lives on 1 HP, while Magcargo goes down to Earthquake from Machamp, and I send in Espeon to replace them. I'd seen in my previous failed attempt that Espeon outsped and did a substantial chunk of Salamence's health with Psychic, meaning he could take Salamence down with a little support, but the problem was getting Espeon 2 chances to attack. Just about every Pokemon on Evis's team one-shot Espeon or came close, meaning he simply couldn't stay out long enough. However, with Heracross still on the field baiting a finishing blow from Salamence, Salamence was guaranteed not to target him, giving Espeon the extra turn he needed. So long as Machamp didn't crit with Earthquake, which thankfully he didn't. Now, when I send in Mischievous, I know that Salamence is going down no matter what, but Evis decides to make it a little easier for me by deciding to use his X attacks this turn. He'll do this once per battle, seemingly at random. I'd been a little concerned about whether Mischievous could take on his Machamp, but now Espeon is guaranteed to remain on the field for another turn still. Salamence goes down first, followed quickly by Machamp, and Evis is left with just his Slowking and Shadow Tyranitar. I've heard this Tyranitar had its catch rate altered to be lower than normal, to the point where it's harder to catch than even the legendary beasts are in this game, but even without that, I'd still recommend using the Master Ball here. Having one less Pokemon to worry about in this battle is ideal. As for his Slowking, the main thing that makes this Pokemon threatening is that they can skill swap Slacking's Truant away, but Slacking's already been dealt with, and it's a 2v1. So she's pretty much a sitting duck. She is able to finish off the heavily weakened Espeon, but simply can't ward off the combined forces of Mischievous and Quagsire, and the battle is won. Everyone from along the way comes in to help us corner the villain. There's a Rule of Cool Deus Ex Machina where Ho-Oh thwarts his backup plan. For this whole ending, it felt like I was glimpsing into an alternate universe where I did find this game to be the underrated gem its fanbase says it is, but while this last bit was great, that's not what most of the game was like. So, there was a spike in my enjoyment towards the very end, but overall, I did not have too great a time with Pokémon Colosseum. In my series ranking thus far, the bottom spot is taken by the Generation 1 games. Between my experience with those and my experience with Colosseum, if I had to pick one to repeat, I would pick Gen 1, in a heartbeat. Like, it isn't even a little bit close. However, as I started writing the script for this video, I realized I had to account for the fact that not all, but a significant chunk of my unenjoyment with this game came directly as a result of my decision to 100% it. How do you 100% Colosseum? Well, you get the Ho-Oh that randomly appeared in the ending cutscene. How do you do that? Well, you catch and purify all 48 Shadow Pokemon in the game, and then complete a certain challenge in the game's battle mode. Completing these steps is absolute misery, and you may have noticed I haven't spoken that much about them in this video. This isn't because I didn't bother, quite the opposite in fact. I would say a good 70% of my recorded footage for this game is just me working towards getting this Ho-Oh. Rather, I haven't spoken much about it yet because I think going for this warps the player's entire experience with this game to such a degree that it warrants its own video, one that will hopefully follow this one soon. If someone were to disregard this completely, just play the main story, ignore any Shadow Pokemon that they aren't actively planning on keeping on their team, beat the bosses, and call it a day, they would likely have a very different experience with this game. And said experience would probably be a lot more enjoyable than mine was.